I trimmed my mustache too small, and I'm aware of that fact, and I'm sorry. I've seen a couple of scary movies. I have seen It Chapter 1, It Chapter 2, and that's it. No, I've seen all of them, all of the horror movies, every single one ever made, and I've noticed a bit of a pattern. They're all about the same thing. For me, theme is a huge thing. Like what the author is trying to convey in their story is more important than just about anything about the story itself. And the other day, Kristen and I watched a Spanish film called Veronica. It's a couple years old, and apparently, according to articles online, it is the scariest film on Netflix. It wasn't scary. It wasn't scary at all. Literally every other movie is scarier than this one. But on top of being like generic jump scares and low light monster reveals, the whole movie was about the most generic thing you can make a horror movie about: grief. And when I was looking up examples of horror movies that I think are about grief, the list was a lot shorter than I anticipated. I thought I like cracked open the whole horror movie industry, but it turns out that there really aren't that many, but there are enough that I think it's worth talking about. Think of a story where the character is haunted or pursued by some force, and in order to defeat the thing that's pursuing them, they need to address some skeleton in their closet, something that's kind of laying over their heads that they've suppressed in their mind for a long time, maybe some emotions about the loss of a loved one. And that's pretty much what it always is. You can probably come up with a few. Midsummer is about this through and through, but it does it kind of uniquely, and I'll get to that later. Pet Cemetery from a couple years ago, I'm not sure how closely it follows the original story or the previous movie adaptation, but yeah, it was about grief. It was about the loss of a child. As Above, So Below. Anyone remember that movie? Probably not, because it was average at best, but we watched it again on Netflix a couple weeks ago, and sure enough, it's literally only about grief. The Others, a great film. Honestly, one of the best horror movies to come out of the early 2000s, is about grief. So, a big offender of this grief thing is Mike Flanagan, who I love. He's one of the best horror directors alive today, and I think he'll go down as one of the best, even if all of his movies aren't home runs. They're all pretty good. Ouija 2, surprisingly pretty good, and it even tied into the first garbage film. Haunting of Hill House was great. If you haven't seen it, go check it out on Netflix. And all of his other movies, except for I'd say Hush, are about grief. It's just a common theme through all of them. Somebody died, and it's about them dealing with the repercussions of that happening. All of this makes sense because horror leans heavily on its theme. A horror movie without a theme is cheap, and that's usually where you find things that are obvious cash grabs, like every other Blumhouse movie, Truth or Dare, Fantasy Island, all of those that are just really low budget and they know they'll sell tickets. That's the whole idea of those movies, is to make money so they can make their Get Out and Whiplash, although that isn't really a horror movie. Horror is all about taboo, addressing things that society isn't really comfortable talking about, and it makes people uncomfortable, which adds to the tension and suspense of the atmosphere that horror creates. And in our culture, we don't really like to talk about death. A lot of other cultures don't view death as, I'll just say Western cultures. Obviously, I'm not from Europe. Instead of celebrating life at the point of death, we just mourn. It's all sad and dreary, whereas a lot of other cultures around the world tend to celebrate the life of the person who had just passed away. In college, I did a presentation on the Hammer horror films, specifically The Mummy, Horror of Dracula, and Frankenstein. I talk about how folklore is often used to address taboo. Usually it's to keep taboos as taboo. Things that we don't talk about in society, we address through stories, and usually the person who addresses those things gets punished for it. But horror movies, I'm just gonna keep going. But horror movies kind of address these taboos and break down walls and make it a little easier to talk about these things. So it makes sense that horror would be the place to talk about grief, especially because usually we're dealing with death, and death brings grief, and that's just how things are. Dude, you wanna not? My problem with this theme is that it's usually a crutch in order to give characters motivation in order to dabble in whatever they're doing. Like, for example, I'll take Ouija 2. The death of their father is a reason for wanting to contact the spirit world, and Veronica is literally the exact same thing down to the Ouija board. And it's almost not horror, but a recent IP, I'll say, that tried to do this was The Outsider on HBO. It was a 10-episode miniseries based on a book by Stephen King, and it's not worth watching. Don't go out and watch it. Just read the book. I know it's a bit cliche, but the book was a hell of a lot better than the show was. And overall, the show just kind of falls flat on its face at about the midpoint of the series. My biggest complaint about it was that it took a story that wasn't about grief and turned it into a story about grief for the screen adaptation, and it weakened it so badly. Obviously, any adaptation is going to take liberties with the story that they're adapting. That's just how it works because they're different mediums. Film is different than prose. If you're just realizing that, then congratulations, you probably really liked Aragon. In the show, Holly doesn't have a background involving Bill Hodges, who is the main character of another trilogy by Stephen King, because that would just be way too much to address. Her backstory is a little more ambiguous in that. But it just would have included too much that is unnecessary, and it didn't harm the narrative at all to not have Bill Hodges be a character in the show. And the inclusion of a few more characters kind of added some extra padding to the length of the story. They, for some reason, decided to go with 10 episodes, even though 8 episodes would have made it a lot better. There was so much filler in the middle of that series that it felt like it was never going to end. But the biggest change that bothered me was the death of Ralph's son. In the book, Ralph's son is at summer camp through the whole story. In the show, he was dead from an unknown ailment. I don't think we hear what it was. I think it was an illness that took him. And that changed Ralph's motivation for the entire series and honestly changed the whole story. If you haven't seen the show or read the book, The Outsider is the story of basically this impossible, disgusting crime that was committed in a small community, and emphasis on the fact that it was impossible what happened. A local baseball coach is accused of sexually assaulting and killing a child, which he denies. And the investigation turns up conflicting, undeniable evidence that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. They're able to provide evidence that he was at the scene of the crime, but they're also able to provide evidence that he was like 200 miles away in another city at a conference. They bring in a private investigator with experience in the supernatural, and she helps them solve the case, which ends up being a supernatural being because it's Stephen King, and most of his stuff doesn't revolve around things that aren't supernatural. And the book was arguably about things that just don't make sense sometimes, and we have to consider options that may seem improbable. It feels like King set out to write a story about a crime committed where there's undeniable evidence of someone committing the crime and also evidence that they didn't. The result ends up being like the Sherlock Holmes quote, when you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It felt like King set out to write a story that really pushes the limits of that. Ralph's son in the book is used as a plot device for the arrest of Terry, the man accused of the crime. Ralph isn't willing to look him in the eye because he coached his son at one point, and it just makes him so disgusted that he thinks that he would kill him if he got his hands on him. And in doing this, in allowing others to make the arrest, he makes a huge mistake in the handling of the case that has big repercussions. In the show, the son is used in the same way for the first couple episodes, but by the end, his son's death is like the driving force behind what Ralph is doing. And it doesn't really connect. I'm going to be spoiling the show just a little bit. Like I said, I don't recommend watching the show, but I won't ruin the whole book, and I do recommend reading that. The one who committed the crime is a shapeshifter, and in no way does that connect to the death of Ralph's son. I think in his therapy, where his therapist is Wally from the best episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia.
That's a storm. You ever been in a storm, Wally?
He tells him that his son's death was out of his control, and he's like trying to move past that in his life. The shapeshifter doesn't factor into that motif at all. As opposed to the book, where the theme of seeing is believing works perfectly, considering the shifter can change its appearance and is indistinguishable from the person it imitates. So like sometimes seeing doesn't even work. The show just abandons that idea that the shapeshifter factors into what we're talking about, the overall theme of the story, whereas the book keeps it consistent. The reason grief feels overused is that it's just a weak motivation in film. It's hard to show on screen, and it usually is predictable as hell. Like in Veronica, her father died, and the creature is pretending to be him, or maybe it is him, it's just a corrupted version of him. So obviously the ending is going to involve her moving on, or trying to move on. Grief is a totally like a fine thing to explore, but you have to at least make it unique. Midsommar uses a very obviously horrible place and tradition to show that the main character has moved on from the grief of her family dying. You think she might dismantle the cult, and that's kind of her way of getting revenge and moving on from what happened, but she instead becomes a part of it, and it's her way of moving on, which is pretty cool and very subversive. The Haunting of Hill House focuses on several aspects of grief all at once, each character representing a different form of how we tend to deal with grief, such as OCD, mental illness, to overworking, to drug abuse. But my biggest issue with this topic is that there are so many other great taboos or themes to explore in your films. I think that's why Get Out is such an amazing film, although it's more of a suspense than a horror. Side note, while researching this video, I found a list that said Rampage was one of the best horror films of 2018, so I guess everything is a spookum now. But Get Out used suspense and horror imagery to talk about race relations, and with Antebellum coming soon, it feels like another filmmaker is focusing on this route. Cam on Netflix was a great look into safety in the sex worker industry, and it also created a pretty suspenseful atmosphere and was a good movie even without looking at the themes that it represented. The Lighthouse, another borderline not horror film, was a great look into masculinity and sexual taboos that we tend to put on men. Basically, horror is the best genre to approach topics society may consider out of bounds, and it's been that way since its inception. And I focused on some pretty mainstream films. Obviously, the farther off the beaten path you get, the more unique you'll see the themes become. Don't be fooled by the first few episodes of The Outsider. It does get bad. Mike Flanagan is the only filmmaker allowed to make films about grief. And that's all I really have to say on the subject. Love you all. Have a good day.